Hello, my name is Andrew Ahn Westover, and I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to today's conversation between Ed Atkins and Massimiliano Gioni. This artist conversation is presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Ed Atkins, Get Life, Loves Work. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members Andrea Calderies and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum public programs are generously supported by the Research and Residencies Council, and digital initiatives are supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. A few logistical notes before we begin. This program will last for approximately 1 hour. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time by clicking the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. If there is time, our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about upcoming programs on our website, newmuseum.org. And now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to the New Museum's Edlis Neeson Artistic Director, Massimiliano Gioni.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, as always. And it's such an honor to be here today with Ed Atkins on the occasion of his new commission and solo show at the New Museum, Get Life, Loves Work. It is somewhat a sign of the times that actually Ed is miraculously in New York City, where he was able to join us for the preparation of the show, and it was quite an accomplishment to be able to bring him over from Europe that required the intervention of lawyers and a national exemption. And yet here we are doing this conversation remotely through a computer because of health and safety, and also because paradoxically, it has become easier to do it that way than in person, which hopefully will not be what our life ends up being like in the future. We are here to discuss a new commission and an exhibition, a new commission that was initiated in partnership with the Experiments in Art and Technology program by Nokia Bell Labs, which, as many of the people at home know, was an initiative created in the 60s by engineers and artists, some famous artists such as John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Martha Minuchin, Lucinda Childs, and many others collaborated on those experiments. We were lucky to be bestowed upon the legacy and the responsibility to resurrect this program. And faithfully, we resurrected this program just a few months before the pandemic. And then this project, which I believe began in the summer of 2019, took on a whole different course from February and March 2020. So maybe, and I apologize for the long preamble, maybe Ed, I'll ask you to walk us through a little bit how the project started or evolved and what you had to contend with, and how particularly your thinking developed as from that first meeting, I think in the winter of 2019 at the Bell Labs in New Jersey, and how he developed.
Sure, yeah. Well, firstly, thank you. And thanks, Mas, for being such an extraordinary host of all of this. Yes, so it began with the invitation, to be part of this extraordinary history, really, the resurrection of the EAT program and, amazing stuff. And yeah, so I suppose from the very beginning, I wanted to, in some way, relate directly to the research that they were doing at Bell Labs, into particular areas of telecommunications and things, but also to engage with aspects of my work, which I presume really are sort of the reason for my initial invitation, really, because actually my work is, for many years now, been very, very interested in the ways in which technology sufficiently or insufficiently represents people and brings people together or apart. Or, you know, mainly I would say that my work is kind of critical of technology's claims for sufficient representation of people and relationships and things. But really, it kind of just began with conversations with the various teams at Bell Labs. I remember a fateful meeting, in that, I guess, was it that winter before? I don't know. I can't remember that first trip up to Bell Labs and sitting in a room, and one of the directors of a particular research area talked about his grandparents, I think, and their sort of struggle to use Skype. At the time, Skype, I think, was probably the preeminent form of this video conferencing thing, and what it meant, I suppose, for them to be able to see their family, but also, I guess, how poignant it was. It makes one very aware of the absence of the other person when you're talking to them like this. It's very pointedly, we're not in the same room. You know, it sort of underscores the absence. Anyway, I kind of went away and concocted a plan to make a moving image work, which would involve taking a group of technicians, really, to various people who are living in various kinds of social isolation, and talk to them about that isolation and capture those conversations with those people using various kind of motion capture technologies, things that I would develop with the Bell Labs technicians, you know. And then after a kind of amazing trip to one of their research centers in Antwerp, and a week spent with the technicians there, we left just as the pandemic was kicking in. And in fact, I live in Denmark, and the lockdown sort of came in literally days after I got back. And so inevitably, lots of things had to change, as they did for everyone, you know. Immediately, a lot of the kind of collaborations that were just starting to gain some traction kind of stopped. Particularly, there was one group of people at a university in Denmark that I was going to work with, and the universities were closed suddenly, so there was no way to do that. But beyond the practical, it became apparent that so much of the initial impetus, conceptual impetus behind the work was not moot, but was getting close to that, you know, sort of obviated by the fact that everyone was living in social isolation suddenly, you know, and that everyone's lives had started to fold in on themselves and seal off into whatever unit they were in before the lockdown came in, you know. So not that I wanted to make a piece that was about COVID, but that, you know, in as much as my work has always been cleaving close to a thing that was now actually happening, it felt important to acknowledge it and to speak from the experience, you know, the kind of interiority that we were all having. So yeah, it quite quickly moved into this idea of talking to my mum. You know, I mean, I think at that point, and it's kind of documented, I suppose, that I think a lot of the kinds of art and a lot of the kinds of experiences that I was taking part in via my apartment online or whatever were kind of intimate, small scale. I mean, necessarily intimate in as much as, you know, you're on your laptop watching someone doing a gig from their bedroom or something. But also, yeah, all relationships were suddenly only really available via telecoms stuff. So anyway, it just became an incredibly obvious but very important thing, was to talk to my mother, who is someone I still haven't seen actually since the whole thing began, as a kind of a relationship that would allow me to model certain kinds of questions that I was having, which I've always had about the technologies of communication and their failings, I suppose. But yeah, that's a rather long and rambling way to say something quite simple, which was that in the end I chose to talk to my mother and to capture that in every possible way, you know. So in the end, I ended up going to Berlin in a tiny little window that was available last summer, and recording this capturing process in a room with a lot of technicians in a hotel suite, covered in dots and Lycra and cameras and things. And And yeah, I just called my mother while wearing all of this stuff, and we talked for a long time. And then I took that data and sort of gleaned what I thought was a documentary. I mean, this peculiar area of like making essentially what amounts to a kind of documentary. It's just that it's animated through this process, which sort of alienates the whole thing, but also serves to underline what's missing, I think, and what's failing, even before one gets to the subject of conversation that we're actually having. Yeah.
And what I think is relevant for the people who are listening today that haven't seen the show yet is that you never see your mom, you just hear the voice, and you see an avatar or a kind of digital reconstruction of yourself, a sort of puppet or an automaton, who also doesn't really resemble you, or actually doesn't at all. And actually, when I finally saw the piece, the first aspect that struck me was, on one hand, it's very confessional, even by your own standards. I don't think you have ever done anything with actual living individuals who speak in the first person and they kind of open up about their own life. But then there is this striking dissonance with the confessional tone and this digital creature who's there that we are told is you, but obviously we are also left with the experience of seeing a robot or a cyborg who is talking to somebody who we assume is your mother, but is also probably a fictional creature of some kind. There is this friction of, who is that person talking to really? And how can that person have an affectionate feeling for what? Because that person is actually a bunch of digital data. So there is that element of further distancing and kind of sophistication that makes it more disturbing, or there is a push and pull between proximity and distance that makes it much more complicated than even telling the background of
it's also, I hope it's a very, it's very reliant on the experience of being in front of it, in as much as some of the things that it sort of offers up in a way are a peculiar understanding of one's own body, or even just the location of yourself in some way, right? Like already just talking to someone down the phone, I often find quite poignant anyway, if it's a loved one, because you feel the absence, what's not there. And I think in this work, there's the question of, what is real in this? Like what is the aspect that does not convince, or it does, or of its reality in some way? Like, who is this? And that the answer to the question of who is quite complicated, actually. Once you've actually gone through all of this ludicrous process of fastidiously capturing what is a real body and then pushing it through this other technical process.
In terms actually of the animation work, I want to ask you two questions. First of all, what is the raw material that you receive after the first session where the live capturing technology is applied on you? What do you get images? Do you get data?
Well, it's the first thing that I got from the team that I worked with in Berlin was all the actual camera footage. So at the same time as it being recorded as data for mapping onto 3D models, there's a load of what's called witness cams, which are basically so that the animators can reference actual footage as well as use the data that's from the motion capture suit. And also there's a sort of a camera mounted on a sort of helmet thing that I wore throughout the whole thing, that's just shining a very bright light on my face, which is covered in dots. So there's the footage from that as well. So in order to work out what they should bother to animate, go into detail with, because once you've got the raw data of the capture thing, you still have to clean this up and really work on it, was to edit the camera footage in a way, and the audio into this thing that would be like, okay, so here are the lists of shots that we're going to go into the process of properly animating and working out the camera positions and all this. And then from that, you know, working out the lighting in the scene, the props, you know, really, you know, pursuing certain desires for like the smudges of fingerprints on the glasses of the spectacles, you know, and then a really fastidious process of storyboarding and timing and all of that, and then back and forth, and you know, yeah, and then in the end, getting back each shot would be broken down into single frames, which then I would import into my software. They have an alpha channel, which means that the background is completely transparent, so I can add a lot of the smoke effects and little bits and bobs like that, and play with focus pulling and the camera movements and all of that sort of stuff. It's an amazing process. But this is the first time I'm working with a team like Mimic, who specialize really in motion capture stuff and what they call digital doubles, and really kind of extraordinary level, you know, of uncanniness, I suppose, in the face, particularly. Yeah.
There is and I'm oversimplifying. On a certain level, it's the exhibition is you would define it as an essay about distance. I think it's also a Gothic family lexicon. There are lots of ghosts.
Yeah.
You know, evocations of people lost.
Gothic's a good call, actually. I hadn't thought of that. You're right.
It's right. Well, I'm projecting on your British origins.
yeah. Of course, that's fine. That's fine. But it is a ghost story. I mean, in as much as the thing that my mother talks about most is her mother, there is this kind of genealogy that flows through the thing of kind of shared experience, or of you know, the unpacking of what's inherited as well in this process. But then, of course, the other ghosts are the people that are not there, who are not dead, as in me and my mother, but are also somehow possessing and animating these kind of more or less cadaverous figures, you know, or this space of the inanimate becoming animated by the body that's not there in some way. So and then, you know, around the space there are these huge embroideries on used linen quilted together, and the writing that's on those, as inscrutable and illegible as it is a kind of, I suppose I think of it as another way of animating them in some way, that is a kind of, in the same way that the golem would be animated by a piece of language written on a piece of paper and sort of placed inside the clay. There is this idea that inscribing language is the kind of the magic that would do this. And these huge lists, so there's one of them is, again, it's a computer process. It's a little bit convoluted, but one of them is a list that Antonin Artaud wrote when he was interred in a asylum in Rodez in the south of France, and just in one of his notebooks, it's a sort of exquisite, hysterical list of what I take to be sort of desires. You know, 200,000 tons of opium, 100,000 tons of cocaine, 300,000 rats. And then I took this quite short list and fed it into an artificial intelligence language generating thing called GPT-3, and generated hundreds of thousands of words. Basically, it continued the list, you know, in all of its lunacy. And then that's what stitched into the thing. Incredible stuff that it came up with. And then the other list that is in there is a list of squalid things from Sei Shonagon, who was a sort of Japanese court lady in the 10th century, I believe. It's a very short list again, and then I fed it into GPT-3, and it spewed out this extraordinary extension of the list of squalid things. And finally, the last embroidery is the most sort of haunted, but also the most sort of brutal, which is, my father kept a diary from diagnosis till death, cancer, not very long. And I've alphabetized that and had it stitched onto the thing, which I suppose, you know, as appalling as that sounds, was another way to speak about how little the technology sort of cares, I suppose. You know what I mean? Like that that it's all of our projections onto these things, and obviously the kind of software engineers and people that design them that kind of renders them seemingly humane in some way, or sensitive even, you know. But these are all projections. So, you know, what's being captured by the motion capture technology and the cameras and stuff is not in and of itself, you know, being in some way, you know. It's what's imbued in it. And of course that's the same with so much, you know. It's not a new aspect of any technology, in as much as language does the same sort of seemingly great but also paltry job of trying to sufficiently remember what is lost, you know. Anyway, so these lists, which are also a kind of crude algorithmic process going through an artificial intelligence system, which is the sort of the most advanced of its kind, you know, in order to produce essentially noise or texture or material, which is then interpreted by us in some way as moving, melancholy, or not, you know. But all of it is, I believe, kind of suffused with our almost instinctive understanding of it not being alive, right? Which would connect to the uncanny, but is also a sort of is a route to the kind of unnameable loss that we might feel in the face of these things, or every time we talk on the phone, really, you know, I suppose.
Yeah, you know, with the text, I was thinking yesterday, there is this they are in a sense automatic writings.
Yes. Yes.
Both the embroideries and also these other texts that maybe you can tell us a little more about.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Kind of collectively written, no, with contemporary art daily writing. So there are automatic writings, but unlike the automatic writings of the surrealists, they don't claim a kind of deeper access to the unconscious or to a truth. They're actually automatic writing. They're both spam and junk and or preserve the illusion of authenticity, but they are completely fake and completely machine made. No.
Well, the wall texts that's real people writing that, you know, even if it is partially kind of, I mean, this is a kind of another perversion in a way, is that part of what I take to be their process is another kind of estrangement from, you know, an unburdening of the problem of being a named individual who wrote something, right? You know, so there's a certain power that comes with that anonymity, but also, it does bring it closer to a kind of ventriloquism, like, you know, the sort of occupying or projecting of a voice onto an object that doesn't usually have one or something, you know. And there's a lot of presumptuousness to the writing in the kind of plural we did this, which is both slips between speaking for society as a whole, but also speaking as the museum or as me even, you know, that it sort of claims because of its anonymity or in its plurality in some way. But yeah, it's also got the kind of texture of Wikipedia entries in certain points, and these other kinds of voices of the digital in a way, and of art discourse in relation to that, I suppose. But yeah, you're right about it is the opposite of a kind of surrealist game, in as much as this thing is not getting closer to an unconscious, but moving further and further away from it, really. Or it's just a wholly alien unconscious, right? Which is one that we have no sort of clue of or something, you know.
Yeah. There are other two, let's say, either ghosts or presence in the palimpsest of the show. You know, actually the way in which the image is projected and it's onto this collage of used sheets and that are embroidered. And so we have a palimpsest with the words and the linen and then the image on top. And then the image, and I don't even know how relevant or openly deliberate it is, but in the kind of interview, there is all this continuous reference to the last interview of the playwright Dennis Potter, which I don't know if he served as an inspiration, or maybe you can tell a little more.
Yeah,
the setting is very similar to that interview, and I don't know if you scripted also your movement, or if you scripted your own storyboard on it. And so if you can tell us a little more how that presence is there, and maybe tell us a little more of what that interview is and what it represented for yourself.
Totally. I think I was thinking about this earlier, talking to someone else, but that oftentimes making work for me has a certain aspect of exorcism about it. And as much as like some leitmotif or some moment or something is lodged in me. And the Dennis Potter interview, the last interview with him, where he knows he's going to die, and he speaks with this sort of insane eloquence about dying, or about illness, about a kind of reconnection. It has the kind of flavor of abjection, but is also exquisite and beautiful. He talks about the famous line from this interview where he's talking about looking out the window and seeing the blossom on the tree, and it's the blossomest blossom he's ever seen. And there's this kind of extraordinary clarity that he's speaking through about finally being present. I mean, really present, And this was something that, it suffuses a kind of an idea of what the work in its broadest discourse is kind of doing. Because, really there's a kind of insistence in the work via absence on the miraculous nature of having an embodied life, a mortal life, but also one where you get to leave the new museum and wander out into the sun, into the appallingly hot street, outside of this chilly purgatory that the room is occupying. And part of the aesthetic of the Dennis Potter thing is to directly conjure that ghost, another ghost, I suppose. And also that kind of hermetic studio look, that kind of actually vestigially like sort of analog technologies of late 80s and early 90s television. Even the aspect ratio of the thing is 4:3, which is not really a contemporary ratio. It's that of, it speaks of the analog, and it's sort of those sort of gestures to me are other ways to potentially plug into a sort of unconscious feeling of which I want the audience to be in, I suppose, or a kind of, like they're recognizing these things, not necessarily in a conscious way of like, 4:3 is the ratio of CRT TVs or whatever, but in a way that is residually kind of connects with those technologies which were of that time, or whatever. And even the lighting in it, I think the colors and things are so of the time. They feel like they are the saturated colors of another technological period in some way, which I guess is another way really, to sort of push hard at certain perversions that are happening in the work, like the heresy of the computer generated figures performing as real people and saying words that are spontaneous and real, and at the same time inside of this weird space there's a point where the figure, which is me, picks up a glass which isn't there and drinks from it and puts it back down, which is obviously, when we were making it, I did actually pick up a glass and drink some real liquid, but this sort of very pointed moment of completely ruining the illusion, and yet it's completely unacknowledged within the video itself. I mean, there's a lot of things like that, like the reference to Gillian Rose's Love's Work, which is sort of brazenly part of the title, is also this thing that's been with me for a long time, her book, and a particular chunk of it where she is talking about her stoma and her colostomy bag, which sounds appalling, but she writes about it in a way that I've never encountered anything as extraordinary. She speaks of the fecundity of life, the warmth. It's extraordinary, I think. And even though my world in the show is cold and absent and, almost intangible and certainly inscrutable, I hope that it sort of, perversely points or paradoxically points back towards the very things that are missing, the bodies and the loves,
Well, there is an insistence also on materials, which is unusual also for your work, I think, or I don't think you had manifested so much, people or think of your work, think of videos, think of images, think probably of words and language. But in this show, there is also a use of obtuse materials like wood and the mattresses or the pillows and the sheets. And most apparently is this large empty box of wood onto which the video is attached, and this sits kind of inertly in the center of the room. And I forgot the dimensions, but maybe you remember it.
I think it's nearly 14 foot high, and it's 4'3", so it's nearly square. But it extrudes out the back, as it were, from the image.
And it's what, something like 20 feet long or
something like that. Yeah.
So it's large. I don't know, is it a coffin? Is it a...
Right.
It made me think of, I mentioned that, the Bruce Nauman room with my soul left out. There is this kind of sense of uselessness and emptiness. And I don't know even if you have any narrative conception around that object, but you want to talk a bit more, what is that object in the room?
I think in relation to what you've already said, really is I often really want and kind of push for extremes of media, in as much as because the CGI thing is so intangible and sort of so much attached to a world that is not present at all. Things like mattresses, or rather the sort of acoustic foam thing placed on the floor, and this huge, very blunt object, this sort of, not graceless because it's rather nicely made, but this sort of bare, absolutely base level thing, right? Like this is, as an object, as a shape, as a sort of space, it's so rudimentary, right? It's a sort of almost primal sort of space, and in that kind of primacy or something, I find that it can kind of offer up an awful lot of analogs, like you say, like this sort of like a coffin, but also other kinds of rooms, other kinds of containments. There's sort of peculiar sense that, of course, the big acoustic things could fit inside this. That the show is almost this sort of unpacked thing that, even in its kind of being unpacked, there isn't really the revelation that you would have, right? There's no kind of like, oh, I understand this thing now, because there is a kind of opacity to the whole thing as well. But I suppose I wanted it to be the kind of foil of the show in a way, this kind of really brute wooden room, like a profound, I hope, way to describe an emptiness that lurks behind the thing. In as much as there's a lot of figurative terrain to this thing, there's also a lot of very literal kind of push of like, yep, this is empty, and that emptiness is meant to to be felt elsewhere as well.
And would you say it's the first time you use in a sense a sculptural element on this scale, or
sort of? I mean, it sort of bears equivalence, if only in that regard, to the big racks of costumes that accompanied a show called Old Food that I did, that was around in various different iterations and things. And it's sort of, I wanted it to stand in a similar way, in as much as there's quite a lot of found material to the show, right? And all the way down to the 3D models, which are all off the shelf. That nothing is really bespoke made in this situation. It's customized, but
what in the 3D models?
So the figure, the male figure in it, who I'm playing or is playing me or whatever, is just off the. You can just buy him.
Oh.
I mean, or he's basically, he wasn't made for this project, right? So he is he's sort of an actor you could hire, right, in some peculiar way. But in the same way that also the linen is gleaned from eBay, it was someone else's. It doesn't, which I suppose is somehow weirdly important for me, that all of the objects and the materials and things have this kind of uncontrollable foundness to them. Like it's a way to get rid of some mannered choice involved in making the work. So the stains on the things, they're not mine. I didn't put them there. Or the
And so can I ask you, this is interesting on a very practical level. Is that always the case that, say, the character to a certain extent is ready-made? Or
always, yeah. Completely.
And how does that, and so you sort of build it up with...
Well, you think of it like if you were trying to make a sort of realistic movie, you'd probably go out and buy a phone, right, to be the phone in your film or something. So it's the same. There's a lot of online marketplaces of 3D objects. The main one that I've used before is called Turbo Squid, which is a kind of a marketplace of 3D objects. But almost anything you can possibly imagine, there will be a 3D model of it now. From a Brussels sprout to a dragon. Of course, there are extraordinarily lacking aspects to it, like the kinds of bodies that you can purchase and use it's an incredibly narrow world. It's a peculiar one because I don't quite know who else is using this stuff and what for.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, you can get any item of sort of furniture you can possibly imagine. So, like the table and the chair, which are I forget the original designers, the Eames chair, the cantilever thing.
Yeah,
that you just buy them. Someone once modeled them, and then you can buy that model. But yeah, it is. I really enjoy the aspect of taking objects and then placing them. It is a much more curatorial exercise in a way, rather than one of generating something.
And have you ever had overlaps with other authors? I mean, have you ever found any of your characters then being in turn animated or used by others?
Yeah. It's often hard to tell. I mean, not the human figures, but there are certain props that when you make stuff like this, or previous works particularly, you get so familiar with the limits of certain props that you've bought that when you see them, there's an ear that I've used a number of times, a giant ear, and I've seen it in a couple of other people's work, because I think it was a free model, or it was like $10, and it was a really good ear for not much money. So so that kind of thing, of course, someone else is out there going, I need a big ear, and type it in, and look, there's a great one for like $5 or whatever. Anyway, but yeah. But again, like I said,
I was asking if you ever put your work in this sort of commons ever to sort of feedback into it, or is that an interesting aspect of?
Well, I mean, if I made models, I think put them on these kinds of marketplaces, because I'm a sort of customer in a way of this world, or a consumer, maybe more interestingly. It doesn't. I guess it doesn't work so much like that. I mean, like, Oliver Larrick does these sort of amazing scans of classical sculptures and casts and things, and then it's wonderful. On his Instagram, you can see their use. You can see them sort of crop up in pop videos, or in any of the sort of, in advertising particularly, which is really the world of this. This is what these things are for often. It's like the short form, lower budget thing. I mean, Pixar's not buying stuff from Turbo Squid, that would be insane. Everything in their world is bespoke, of course, probably including the software, I would think. But yeah, it's a thrilling world. I mean, I'd recommend to anyone, just go onto turbosquid.com and start rummaging around, even if you don't want to use it. You get a preview of each of these objects, and then their kind of constitution, the levels of their skin, the whether they're rigged or not, which means that they sort of have a skeleton that you can then animate with. It's a universe of something. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you actually, the sort of tangentially. Sometimes your work is seen, let's say, in the context of post-internet or work about the digital condition. And I know you are somewhat skeptical also of that labeling. And first of all, how did it feel, on the other hand, also to be associated more or less vaguely, but with these earlier experiments in art and technology and that debate from the 60s, in which obviously technology probably had a different maybe hope to it, or you know, even just the fact that this show happens in this moment in time, you know, invests with different notions of what technology can do, and certainly maybe less optimistic readings of even though, you know, we have been all saved by technology in this last year and a half, because at least we could speak to our parents or our dear ones through it.
Totally.
I don't know if I mean, first of all, I don't know if when working on this show, you had to think, because of the moment in time in which it was happening and because of the sort of legacy that was evoked by this commission, if you had to think more, you know, precisely around some of these topics or not, you know, I'm curious. And more broadly, do you see your work as being about technology, or do you see it about being more about existential questions? I know it's
really
a big
interesting, actually.
question for a Wednesday morning.
Well, I think interestingly, where the direction from which the attachment to technology is coming from, or even the accusation of your collusion with technology, where that's coming from is part of the where you want to choose, right? You kind of like the kind of connection with EAT, and like you said, a certain kind of tech optimism, I suppose, or at least like, look, this is stuff that one can do at the time. This is stuff no one could possibly do without the help of Bell Labs, you know. Whereas I think that probably the you know, total ubiquity of technologies that are pretty extraordinarily advanced in all of our lives at all times means that just what technology is, or what we even mean when we sort of offhandedly say that, has changed so radically that it's very hard to easily mesh the two, I think, you know, or what advanced technology is, because it's also that increasingly one of a certain kind of technological progress is about how well the technology can disappear and be invisible to us, right? You know, and I think part of my interest in it is an inheritance from a kind of technological not pessimism, ambivalence or something, you know. Is a kind of like, okay, well one job would be to just try and hold on to the technology because it's trying to disappear at all times, you know. I don't see the work as about technology, but I do see it as you know, employing that discourse, you know, and it relies very heavily on that, but it relies just as heavily on people's familiarity with technology as much as it being. So it's not really about the novelty of technology at all. It's about the kind of extraordinarily deep familiarity that we all have with technology in some way. So it's more like that. It's like, okay, so technology, but the ways in which one can talk about it or through it or whatever are so numerous that it's quite hard to sort of feel, like lumped in with sort of post-internet, because that seems to present far more problems in terms of any kind of category than solve them, right? You know, and at this point, I'm not sure that even exists as a thing anymore. It's sort of a point in time, right, in 2012 or something, or 11 or 10, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, the work is of technology. I mean, it is oftentimes much more existential, as you say, you know. But what kind of existence?
In this show, and also you just released the book called Drawings for Children, or
yes,
which both in the exhibition and the coincidence of that book coming out now, you know, there is as I mentioned earlier, a fascination with the analog that maybe is a new or has become more apparent,
right.
and And the book, you want to talk a little bit about what the book is, and
sure.
It's a book of drawings, so it's a book, and drawing has become more visible, no, in your work.
Yeah, it was also, you know, a product of the last year and a half. It was me doing a drawing every day for my daughter's lunchbox. So I'd do a drawing and then put it in her lunchbox, and when it came home, I'd scan it, and then was just sort of keeping them. So it is its own sort of peculiar document of a period of time, even though there's barely any words in the book. So it's just the drawings, you know, but it's 200 and something drawings. And I do think, I mean, I'm fascinated by a completely understandable kind of rejection of certain technology, and a sort of reversion to, or an attempted reversion to, certain kinds of more analog processes and things, you know. Certainly, yeah, you know, like people sort of quitting social media or whatever, or just sort of backing away from the things that pertain to, claim to make life more convenient, but actually end up really complicating it, if not practically, then psychically. You know, like to be on social media is to navigate a lot of psychical difficulty, you know, and it's really treacherous terrain. And I think maybe the kind of enforced, or the grounding of everyone in some way, it probably for a lot of us did a number on like making us go back to analog things, you know, and analog relations, because the only people you know, you were inside yourself and your house and your little unit or whatever, you know. So
yeah,
and I think that's also within the kinds of music and sound stuff that I've been listening to throughout the thing has increasingly been something adjacent to field recording sort of stuff, you know, and stuff that is kind of part of the show as well. This kind of incidental music, which is very much about the space in which it was recorded, and the proximity of a body to a microphone, say, or a proximity of a hand to a keyboard, or the birds out the window, or, you know, all of this sort of stuff becomes, I think, you know, it's all been rather moving in the last year, a lot of those things, I think, you know. So yeah, they're a lot of it is symptomatic stuff. Yeah.
I think just to also break out of our self-referentiality, I wanted to see if there are questions from the audience, but one of the recurring questions so far was also to show some images of the show. So I clumsily put together some images,
amazing.
and I'm going to share them, and then maybe we go through some of the questions. I don't know if you see them. And
that's very good. Well done.
It's
Thank you.
Done, as we say in Italian, espresso. So here you see the projection onto the screen, which is also this kind of soft, I call it mattress because it's covered with this collage.
It's actually, it's sort of, it comes out of acoustic foam padding that I would have to usually sort of surround rooms in, right? You know, it's a sort of attempt to make an object that's practical as well as aesthetic, as well as, you know, that is also an acoustic panel is absorbent, you know. So I kind of like the figurative terrain of some absorbing thing, you know. But yeah.
Well, at least you brought in Artaud. One can't avoid thinking that padded rooms are also
I know.
Rooms, you know? So there is that.
I know.
Which I don't think it was a conscious, but it's somewhat inevitable as a. And so here you see the how the screen attaches to to the sculpture or the installation, and here is another view, and then another view of the interior. And but let's see now if there are some questions. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I know we have a few questions that I have to run through, or some are very well. Somebody just asked about the field recording and the sonic aspect of your work. What does that mean? And more generally, the sonic aspect of your work.
Yeah, it for reasons that are still slightly elusive to me, the visuals are always, you know, extraordinarily artificial, but the sounds are often as sort of real as I can get them. So I haven't changed anything about my voice, for example, or my mother's voice on the phone, even though obviously the kind of the timbre of her voice down a phone line is very recognizably that. The other sounds of me at the piano and sort of improvising is basically the other side of the room. There's this sort of incidental music soundtrack thing, which is sort of one long performance. It's not very long, like 15-minute performance at the piano, singing. But it's also very intimate, you know. It's me right up to the microphone and right on the piano and trying to kind of conjure sounds out of my throat and out of the piano, which are as sort of that would somehow occupy a similar emotional, affective terrain as the video. You know, it would be awkward and it would be slightly embarrassing, but it would also be real, and trying to sort of conjure like a significant new level of real from my throat by singing at limits of my range, or by making sounds that are not particularly typically beautiful or anything, but they are very true, I suppose. It's an awkward word, isn't it? But yeah, and I suppose the world of that kind of music is one that I've been very keen on, particularly in the last couple of years. Yeah.
Is it the first time that you perform the soundtrack as in the first person, let's say?
Yeah. It's usually music always plays a big part in the work, you know, but it's often the other end of music. It would often be like almost the kinds of classical music that would be used in car adverts or something. You know, it was a very, like Ravel's Bolero is a significant thing in a piece of work of mine, because I wanted to use it because it was so ubiquitous again. You know, it's something that everyone was immediately sort of aware of, you know, as an incredibly popular piece of music. But then, in lots of works, Foley becomes really important, particularly with animation as well. Oftentimes, adding or exacerbating little bits of sound and things, scratches and things, a kind of world that's off camera, which serves to convince of the kind of authenticity of what's being shown in a way. So it sort of segues between the two, between a kind of aesthetic mode and one that is about convincing of the diegetic space of the film, you know, of the animation. Sound is a way to add weight as well. You know, it's literally as a thing that sort of vibrates. You know, it's the sense when you hear something, it is literally possessing your body as well. You know, it's vibrating your eardrum or whatever actually happens in there. But you know, so it has a kind of you know, a penetrative aspect to it, and I think part of the effectiveness of music, particularly in sound generally, and voices as well, is one of it being incredibly corporal to listen to something. Yeah.
There is a question that sort of relates, or is the relationship between your writing practice and the work in the moving images. So when do you write, and do you write the films in a sense, or what is the relationship between the two?
I don't really write the films. No, it's oftentimes some, you know, like this one would start much more, whether it did or not, but it would be much more likely to have started from the persistence of the scene of Dennis Potter, the persistence of certain desires of things I wanted to see and wanted to try. So this one, certainly part of it was just stemming from a personal inquiry, not really a legitimate research into kind of thinking about what realism might be in relation to the work, you know, and in relation to lots of other kinds of realism. So when one describes the imagery as realistic, what are we talking about? Realistic in regards to what? Just the way it looks, certainly not realistic in terms of its anima or whatever, but also realism in relation to the thing that me and my mother talk about in the film, which is a kind of persistence, certainly in our family, of speaking about the truth as something that is almost always miserablist in some way, that is always a kind of negative, you know, that the truth of everyone is a kind of misery in some way. This is not really a thing that we've talked about directly before, but it's something that's very persistent, as an almost another kind of inheritance, a sort of the texture of the presumption of where the real is. And that would also relate then for me to the abject, you know, the truth of our bodies is death, right? And shit and blood and piss, you know, and that, you know what I mean? But that those things, because of culturations of all kinds, are seen as negative or sad or attached to, etc., etc. Anyway, but yeah, trying to sort of, the sound stuff is trying to speak. I'm constantly trying to speak very viscerally to the body as much as the brain, I suppose. You know.
Mm-hmm. And in the writing itself, do you?
Oh, the writing. Yes. Sorry. There was a question about
okay.
that.
Well, they're complementary to each other. I'm curious how actually the writing works, and I mean, you alluded to the fact that, for example, in this exhibition there are forms also of both automatic writing, collective writing, found writing in the case of your father's diary, which you also published. So I'm also interested in how you navigate the kind of, you know, the writer in third person, whatever that means. Or, you know, I thought also of this piece as a kind of autofiction, you know, to use a term that maybe has become a little too overused, but
no, sure. I think.
How do you describe your writing? Is it fiction? Is it?
I mean, I'd probably be cowardly and try and avoid giving it a label and try and say something awful like text or something. But it's certainly like, well, there's the expedience of writing, right? You know, as in, for me at least, I don't really have a sketchbook or anything like that. But I don't really keep notes either. It's more just sort of sitting down, and the kind of the event of writing is one that I really love. I love sitting down in front of the keyboard and starting to write, you know, or trying to sort of find a way back to writing some words. And I think there is, again, something, unavoidably basic about that, or that it doesn't require much, you know, I can just sort of do it anywhere. It's a very bare process, and from that one can sort of build more explicitly, I think. But also, it's just, I don't know, it's what I feel most comfortable sort of generating. I don't really feel very comfortable about, a bit like using all the found stuff, is I find it quite difficult to just like start with nothing and then make something. Except for writing, maybe. I think that's as close as I get to it, I think. But I don't, in terms of the effect or what I want to write towards or whatever, it's not that far away from all the things we've been talking about with the video and the drawings and things. Is they're all in the same place to me. They all want to speak of this about things in the same way, you know.
But were you, let's say, trained as a writer or trained as a? So you would say,
I mean, in as much as art school isn't really training, it wasn't. I mean, you know, not in the kind of sense of like I can now paint Trompe l'oeil stuff or something, but I went to art school, you know. But I think I think growing up, I think books and literature, certainly for my father, were sort of the pinnacle in some way, and they were the thing that was around. It's quite, you know, and as much as it's also a much more democratized thing than a painting, isn't it? You know, books, people have them and you get to keep them, and then you get to sort of, I mean, for better or worse, you know, having a book published is still somehow has this kind of hold over me of like, this is it, this is the pinnacle of what I can do somehow, you know. But I mean, I can't remember the question. I'm sorry.
You mentioned, I'm actually skipping the audience question because you spoke about, you just mentioned your father, and that made me think of another constant presence in your work, which is malehood, or, you know, the fact that even in this video about your mother or about a mother, the person on screen is a generic white guy, and that is always the kind of recurring phantom of your pieces. Not this whether you or variations on you. But
Mm-hmm.
there is this, you maybe because I think of your work also in the lineage of people like Naumann, or this kind of reflection on the self, but that self is a guy, and that being a guy has also become finally, and maybe joyfully, immensely problematic. And so I'm curious if you think your work also circles around those questions of, I don't want to say of gender, but of assumptions and expectations around power and around strength. I mean, all your characters are often actually weak and kind of decaying or unsure. So
I think again, it's not really about any of these things, but it's an unavoidable aspect of a kind of, whatever you were referring to as autofictional, or a sort of inward looking thing, and I think ever since making the computer generated thing, the presence of the idea of a kind of avatar, right, what that might mean in terms of, okay, this is a sort of vessel of desire or of modeling traumas of all kinds or something, and in as much as one's sort of inherited identity or certain kinds of presumptions about one's identity are traumatic, the promise of using this kind of world to model some of those things, some of that stuff I can speak to. There's also a kind of, necessarily in using off-the-shelf models, one is limited by what one can find, I mean, deliberately. Of course, I could make other work. I could make work and make different models or use anything else. But there is a kind of flat-footedness that I quite like. I quite like the kind of slightly sort of tasteless, allegorical aspect of just using, like, oh yes, click, this is the good model of a white man that will be me, And of course, in that process is a massive sort of erosion of all the nuances of an actual identity and of an actual body. But that's part of the work, is this the compromise that technology forces in its process of representation, or in its processes of rendering, or its processes of capturing, all these kind of more or less symbolic real violences which the technology is enacting in its pretense of being accurate, So it's sort of, I think that obviously the kind of my own sense of the masculinity or something, or the performance of it is certainly in the work, but it's also, I think, sort of treated at the same level as almost everything else, in some way. It's about the kind of bluntness with which this instrument, which again pertains to be accurate or exacting in some way, how it's not, how much is missing from that account that it can give,
Let's see if there is possibly a final question. There is an interesting phenomenon when doing Zoom talks, that around the hour people leave. And where do they go? I mean, we still have a lot of people, but it's interesting to see the hour is when people
better things to do. They got lunch or
something. I have this vision like your hamburger full of lost souls precipitating down, and where are they going from Zoom? How dare they to go to real life? And I think, well, there is a specific question about the GPT-3, which is the software that maybe you can tell us about.
I almost certainly can't tell you much about it.
To use that software, and how does it work? This is me asking that, and how does it play with natural language models?
Well, the answer is probably a bit disappointingly quick, which is I don't really know. I don't really know what it's doing. But in my defense, I also don't really know. I'm not a technician. I don't really know what's going on. I do know that it's another technology that sort of hyperbolizes its own capacity to emulate or be better than humans at certain things or whatever. And it is extraordinarily impressive that everything that it spews out is by a computer, right? Or is by an algorithmic process. But again, the sort of my interest in it is to point at it a lot, you know, is to sort of underscore it in itself somehow by asking it to do things which it can of course do, but which serve to kind of underline the fact that it's more about why someone writes this thing, right? You know, like the question of a list is not one of its sort of literary quality, but it's kind of account of the desires or the accounting of someone writing that list, you know. So a woman in Japan in the 10th century writing a list of squalid things, it's about her and not about the list. So the kind of feat of extending the list by artificial intelligence means is it doesn't mean anything because the thing doesn't mean anything. You know what I mean? That sounds a bit convoluted. Anyway, you can try it. I mean, there's plenty of like demo versions of it. If you just Google GPT-3, or I think I use it through a portal that's called InferKit, if anyone wants to try it. I recommend it. I mean, it's remarkably addictive to do. And sort of in the end point, I mean, I don't know. I'm wary of like it being a tool for making art of any kind. You know, I don't think it's that yet or ever, and I'm not really interested in it for that reason. But I'm interested in it as a way to not make a choice. You know, definitely.
Well, I think there is the last question. It's maybe a little romantic, but because it's the work as a mother. But we have a question about how does childhood enter your work? I mean, obviously, if there is a mother, there is a child.
I think one thing I would say is that I don't think this work would have happened if I hadn't had a child myself. You know, if I didn't have a child myself, I think that it makes one confront aspects of one's own childhood and try to think about them. And also just, you know, I think there's a point in most people's lives, if they're lucky enough to have their parents still around, is to start asking them about their life. You know, the things that one doesn't even think to be interested in when you're actually someone's child, as in your parents' life. Necessarily, this is just me. I'm just projecting onto other people as well. But you know, at a certain point of wanting to know these things, wanting to understand, to be equipped with a way to interpret a person's actions as well, and the things that I've inherited, things that are inside me, which maybe my mother can shed some light on. And I don't mean it quite so selfishly as that sounds as well. I'm genuinely, I want to get to know her, you know. And this is obviously this document, this conversation is a tiny aspect of that process, and is a very public and strange and peculiar one, which has to be about other things. But personally, it can also be about me wanting to talk to my mother, you know, about her childhood and about her mother. Yeah. But so childhood comes in constantly in the relation, but also in her recollection of, you know, dressing up as a child, dressing up as an old man, which she does talk about in the thing. Yeah, and as a ground, I suppose, right? I mean, the childhood is, you know, I think what's not spoken about, there is still a vast amount that's unspoken in the process, is just that, you know, the things that I could say in response to my mother about what I've inherited of those things that she inherited, you know, the kind of chain. Anyway, I mean, that stuff, yeah, I don't know. I don't quite know what to say about that stuff yet, but yeah.
There is a question about performance, and I know you mentioned you are either writing or about to perform a play in Denmark.
Yeah, me and a wonderful writer who also lives in Copenhagen but is from around here, called Steven Zoltansky, are writing a play to be put on at a theatre called Revolver in Copenhagen next year. Yeah, but neither of us are performing in it. This is a real attempt to like make a legitimate play rather than an art performance or something. It's I mean, it'll still be weird, but you know, yeah.
But you have performed, and in a sense also the light capturing, you have worked on it as a form of performance. Now some of these avatars were born also as a live event. No?
Yeah. I mean, the technology is called performance capture, right? So it necessitates, particularly if you're, you know, like even in the conversation with my mother, it has to be a performance by dint of the witnessing of the recording of it, right? The capturing is kind of points out that it of course is a performance, but also because you have to be in certain ways for the technology to recognize you. You know, you have to perform for the technology to see you in a way. You know, there are profound questions of visibility and surveillance at work in that, you know, and also the technology's biases and prejudices, which are sort of programmed into them in certain ways. But so there's that kind of performance. But I also, you know, totally less so in this one, but I also like performing. I like being, you know, another kind of extreme of opposite to the video is standing alone on stage and performing without accoutrement, you know, just doing that. So yeah, but again, I see that as a kind of italicized relation to the videos in some way, you know.
So I guess we have to wish we will see you live soon, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we didn't
you,
exhaust all the questions. We have a great audience that is still asking, but I'm afraid
that's very nice.
We have to go. But
well, hopefully if they can make it to the show, then they can have some of those questions answered in some way. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. And
thank you, Mass.
Good to see you. And we'll speak soon. Thank you to everybody. I guess you say at home. I don't know. I don't know what's the etiquette of Zoom conclusion, but thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.